Hello everyone, and welcome to our lecture series for Chapter 22 in your textbook, Give Me Liberty by Dr. Eric Foner. This chapter is entitled Fighting for the Four Freedoms, World War II, 1941 to 1945. This first section is called Fighting World War II. The focus question for this first section is what steps led to American participation in World War II? The United States certainly was not the only country that was affected by the Great Depression in the 1930s. Although the Depression did begin in the United States, the ripple effects of it spread very quickly around the world and caused much inner turmoil in many countries around the world, which in some places led to the rise of authoritarian governments. A few of these new authoritarian regimes, particularly Japan, Germany, and Italy, began to try to project their power outwards and begin a new round of imperialism. And by the mid-1930s, war, in fact a worldwide war, seemed to be on the horizon. Japan invaded Manchuria, which is in northern China, and began to project and establish a new Pacific Empire of Japan. In Germany, there was an attempt by Adolf Hitler to control the entire European continent. The Italian fascist leader Benito Mussolini invaded the African country of Ethiopia and tried to project Italian imperial power on the continent of Africa. There was also the establishment of a fascist government in Spain by dictator Francisco Franco. To most Americans, all of these overseas threats seemed very distant, and for American businessmen in particular, they were very wary of choosing sides in any of these conflicts, as they did not want to give up their markets and their ability to trade with these countries. American businesses traded extensively with both Germany and Japan, and that was a very lucrative trade that few were willing to give up very easily. There was also a desire by many Americans and many American leaders to avoid foreign entanglements altogether. And many Americans viewed the American involvement in World War I as a mistake. This was coupled with the spread of a new pacifist ideology in America that advocated for world peace and to put down arms and to avoid any sort of war altogether. The United States also passed the Neutrality Acts in the 1930s, which basically allowed the United States to avoid any sort of conflicts over this idea of freedom of the seas, that the oceans were there to be utilized by all powers of the world, and no one power could claim authority over the open oceans, thereby leaving the oceans free for everyone to use for trade or travel or things of that nature. Heated up very quickly in Europe beginning in 1939. In that year, Germany and Stalin's Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact where each power promised not to go to war with the other. After this non-aggression pact was solidified, Germany invaded Poland in September of 1939. After this Polish invasion, both Britain and France declared war on Germany, initiating World War II in Europe. By June of 1940, however, the overwhelming might of the German war machine led Hitler to dominate nearly all of Europe and North Africa, and he formed the Axis powers through an alliance with Japan and Italy that year. After Roosevelt was elected to an unprecedented third term of office, he began to express more support for the fight against Hitler. Roosevelt and American leaders were growing more alarmed by Germany's rapid expansion in Europe, plus the fact that Britain was traditionally an American ally. Roosevelt began to lean more to their side of the conflict. The United States passed what was known as the Lend-Lease Act, which allowed countries like Britain and China to purchase military resources on a sort of loan type of program, provided they promised to repay it after the war. There were some interventionist movements within the United States as well, which tried to convince the public that the country must stem the rising tide of fascism around the world. Then came, as FDR so memorably put it, the day that will live in infamy, December 7th, 1941, when Japanese planes launched an attack on the naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Now, many have characterized this as a complete surprise attack, and that is not entirely true. The U.S. knew that the Japanese were up to something. They just did not quite know what or when that something was going to happen. And the reason that the Japanese even targeted America in the first place was the fact that the U.S. stopped selling oil to Japan to try to stem the tide of Japanese expansion in the Pacific. And U.S. oil sales made up about 80% of Japan's oil supply. So the United States cutting off those sales to Japan greatly hampered Japan's ability to continue its expansionist efforts. This attack on Pearl Harbor, of course, led the United States to declare war on Japan. And very quickly, Germany, an ally of Japan, thanks to the Axis Powers Agreement, declared war on the United States the following day, drawing the United States into the war in Europe as well. The war in the Pacific was the first theater that the United States Armed Forces engaged in, of course, because Japan at the time was the primary antagonist against the United States. But the first few months of American military involvement in the Pacific were filled with military disasters. The United States still had a strong presence in the Philippines, and this quickly became a battleground between the United States and Japanese forces. That the United States definitely came out on the short end of the stick in these conflicts. Thousands of United States troops perished in what was known as the Bataan Death March in the Philippines, where the Japanese captured thousands of American troops and forced them to march hundreds of miles across the Philippine Islands to internment camps in the Philippines. The tide began to turn in 1942 with American victories at the Battle of the Coral Sea and the Battle of Midway. These victories allowed the United States to drive the Japanese from many fortified islands throughout the Pacific and slowly but surely brought the American troops closer to the Japanese mainland. In order to counter the Axis Powers Alliance, a grand alliance, the Allies, was formed between the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union against the Axis Powers. The D-Day invasion of Normandy was where the United States first thrust itself into the European conflict, and it was the most massive land-sea operation in history. And of course, much has been covered in history and in public memory about the D-Day invasion. However, the most crucial fighting actually took place on the Eastern Front between Germany and the Soviet Union. Hitler and Germany made a crucial mistake of trying to invade the Soviet Union, totally negating its agreement with Stalin at the outset of the war. And in particular, the battle known as the Siege of Stalingrad was a catastrophic German mistake where Germany suffered untold losses in those battles and significantly hampered its ability not only to prosecute the war on the Eastern Front, but took away focus from the war on the Western Front as well. And this siege of Stalingrad really marked the turning point of the European War and the decline of German military might. Also in this period was when Hitler and Germany initiated what they called their final solution, or what historians have later dubbed the Holocaust, which was the mass extermination of so-called undesirable peoples based on the Nazi belief that Germans constituted a master race destined to rule the world. And that concludes part 1 of our Chapter 22 lecture series. As always, study hard, and I'll see you soon.